In January 1978, Chrysler released the Dodge Omni and Plymouth Horizon to a world hungry for fuel-efficient American cars. Largely unheralded and unchanged over their nearly 13-year run, these were among the most important cars for Chrysler Corporation, rivaling the K cars for sales numbers. Welcome back to All Cars, y'all. If you're new here, I am John, and this is a far too brief history of the Dodge Omni and the Plymouth Horizon. At the dawn of the 70s, Chrysler had a lineup filled with traditional American cars: the Cordoba, Coronet, Dart, Charger, Challenger, and the often forgotten Polara. In 1971, Dodge introduced the Colt based on the Mitsubishi Colt Galant and intended to compete with the subcompacts from other brands such as the Gremlin, Vega, Pinto, and the imports. It was updated in 1973, just before the oil embargo began to hit much of the Western world, driving up gas prices and causing shortages. While the Colt would last through 7 generations until 1995, in 1974 the president of Chrysler, Lynn Townsend, wanted the company to have its own competitor in the market. At the time, Chrysler had a European division that was in the process of developing 3 new platforms, and Townsend sent executives to find a subcompact car for the US market. The first they proposed was the C6 platform, but that was rejected. It went on to become the Simca 1307 and the Chrysler Alpine in 1976 and win European Car of the Year. The second platform Chrysler Europe was working on was a shortened version of the C6 called the C2, being developed to replace 2 different cars, the Simca 1100 and the Hillman Avenger. Now designated to be brought to America, the C2 was intended to be Chrysler's first world car, with powertrain and chassis developed by Chrysler France, body designed by Chrysler UK, and items like cruise control, trip computer, electronic ignition, and more developed in the States. Work started in 1975 and design strove to match the VW Golf as a 5-door hatchback for every market, in fact purchasing nearly 100 rabbits in the US to reverse engineer for what was now designated the L-body platform. U.S. requirements ultimately meant this world car had many functional differences for the U.S., including the McPherson strut front suspension, rear suspension tuning, sealed beam headlights, 5-mile-per-hour bumpers, and the surprising fact that while the European and USA versions look similar, no body stampings are shared between the U.S. or European models. A careful viewing side by side of the US and European horizons, and just a couple of items you can notice are the increased front overhang and more flared wheel arches on the US version. The rear glass of the US models didn't go all the way down, while they did in Europe, primarily as a cost-saving measure. Also, during early development, they considered a 4-door sedan version, but it was never developed out. Initially, it was sold in Europe as either the Chrysler Horizon or the Simca Horizon, and in spite of this promising new car and the success of the C6 platform, Chrysler Europe was suffering financially, and in 1978, the entire division was sold to PSA Peugeot Citroën, which meant that the Chrysler name was dropped from the model and then sold as the Talbot Horizon. Released in 1978, the Omni and Horizon were trailblazers in the US. They were the first front-wheel drive subcompact manufactured in the US and Chrysler's first front-wheel drive car at all, and the first to use a semi-independent rear suspension. While they trailed some imports to the market like the Civic and the Accord, the Chrysler L-body twins gave Chrysler a head start over their domestic competitors, beating Ford and GM to the market by 3 to 4 years. At launch, Chrysler didn't have a suitable engine for the car. Simca had 1.1 to 1.4 liter engines that was decided were just too underpowered, and without a suitable engine of their own, they sourced VW's 1.7 liter engine from the Rabbit, making 75 horsepower and 90 foot-pounds of torque. They designed their own intake manifold for it and mated it to either a 4-speed manual or a 3-speed automatic. Wrestling with emissions regulations meant power went up to 77 in 1978 and back down to 66 horsepower in 1980. While sounding underpowered by today's standards, for comparison, the 1979 Honda Civic 1500 made 67 horsepower, and the rear-wheel drive Chevy Chevette's 1.6 liter made 63 horsepower. In 1981, Chrysler's new 2.2-liter 4 was ready and was slotted in as an upgrade option, boosting power to 84 horsepower and later with fuel injection in 1986 to 93 horsepower and then 96 horsepower in 88, and the engine remained in the car until the end. Early advertisements and brochures bragged the Omni was for, quote, American-sized folk, and if you could lift it in, it could hold it. Based on a 99.2-inch wheelbase and at 163.2 inches long and 66.2 inches wide, it was actually quite roomy compared to imported compacts and still came in at a relatively modest 2,100 pounds. Economy was excellent at 25 city and 39 highway, and oddly the Horizon was sold essentially in one trim line, but with multiple interior or exterior packages that gave you options like white striped tires, two-tone paint, wood grain, power steering, roof rack, and more. At introduction, it sold slowly for a few months as gas prices had dropped and larger cars were selling well, but the twins found their footing and ended up selling over 170,000 units that first year, the majority of which were Plymouths. They were recognized as Motor Trend's Car of the Year, the European Car of the Year for 1979, and those first-year sales equaled almost 18% of Chrysler's total. But almost immediately, storm clouds threatened the car. Consumer Reports tested one and not only gave it a not acceptable rating for emergency handling, that caught the attention of the NHTSA for an investigation. Other media reported no problems with the handling, and Chrysler's own research through their dealers found none, but they still modified the steering, and the next year Consumer Reports gave the twins an acceptable rating. Before we go on with the Omni Horizon story, for 1979, two new models based on the L platform were introduced, the Dodge Omni 024 and the Plymouth Horizon TC3. Instead of simply making a two-door model with essentially the same body, Chrysler created a sportier-looking model sharing no bodywork and on a shortened 96.6 wheelbase, but using the same 1.7-liter powertrain making 70 horsepower. In 1980, the TC3 got a sport package called the Turismo, and on the 024 it was called the De Tomaso, retaining the same powertrain but with special wheels and trim. Also in 1980, electric conversion company Jet Industries took the TC3 024 and created their Electra 007 with a 23 horsepower motor and 26-volt batteries, good for 50 miles of range and a top speed of 70 miles an hour, and surprisingly keeping the stock 4-speed transmission. For 1981, the 2.2-liter engine with 84 horsepower was added as that option, and the Omni and Horizon names were dropped. A special Charger 2.2 package was introduced with spoiler, hood scoop, and graphics, and then in 83, the 024 was renamed the Charger and the Plymouth as the Turismo. Also in 1983, Chrysler partnered with Carroll Shelby to create the Shelby Charger, with revised styling, sharper suspension, and a high-output engine now making 107 horsepower. For 84, the Charger got quad headlights, while the Shelby kept the previous two-headlight front end and offered an optional automatic. For 85, the engine was turbocharged, putting out 146 horsepower. In the November issue of Popular Mechanics, they even included the Shelby in a 1970 Charger RT in the new versus old muscle car comparo, where the new Charger acquitted itself quite nicely. The Charger line ended in 87, and Carroll purchased the last 1,000 Shelby Chargers and modified them to become the GLH-S. Goes like hell some more. Turbocharged to 175 horsepower and 175 pound-feet, it also received a stronger 5-speed manual and, interestingly, was sent to dealers not as a Dodge, but as a Shelby. Also in 82, Chrysler offered yet another version of the L bodies as a two-door ute with the Dodge Rampage and the Plymouth Scamp. Technically the first front-wheel drive American pickup, it took the front of the 024, its wheelbase was stretched to 104.2 inches, added leaf springs to the rear and a 2.2-liter engine, a 4-speed manual or a 3-speed auto, and was left with a load capacity of 1,145 pounds, only 105 pounds less than the larger Chevy El Camino. For 83, it received a 5-speed manual, and in 84, the front was facelifted along with the Charger with quad headlights. The Plymouth Scamp was only offered in 83, and the Rampage ended in 1984. In 1981, the Omni and Horizon received a Miser edition, largely stripped of options and intended to be both a low-cost and high-mileage leader. In 83, the VW engine was dropped and the entry-level engine became a Peugeot Simca-sourced 1.6-liter whose design dated back to 1961 and made 62 horsepower and 85 pound-feet of torque. In 84, the Sport Edition was introduced with two-tone paint, while the model line got a light refresh with a new dash, a 5-speed manual became standard, and most chrome pieces were replaced with black. Also in 84, the most famous version debuted, the Omni GLH. Originally, Carroll Shelby proposed the name Coyote for the car as it would be chasing rabbits, but Chrysler rejected that idea. So while the meaning of GLH was never officially specified, it was understood by all to mean goes like hell. The 110 horsepower high output 2.2 liter was used with suspension, brakes, and tires upgraded. In 85 and 86, Shelby upgraded the GLH with that 146 horsepower 2.2 liter turbo. And then, in 1986, Shelby purchased the last 500 GLH turbos and created the GLH-S, similar to the Shelby Chargers with extensive modifications including updating the turbo, adding an intercooler, changing the injectors, wiring harness, throttle body, and more, along with graphics, adjustable shocks, and special wheels. The result was a 12 psi maximum boost and 175 horsepower and 175 pound-feet, good for a 0 to 60 time of 6.5 seconds when tested by car and driver. In 1987, the Dodge Shadow and Plymouth Sundance were introduced, originally intended to replace the Omni and Horizon twins, but the L-bodies continued to hang around and the Shadow and Sundance were moved slightly upmarket. Chrysler then introduced the America edition of the Omni, dropping the price to compete directly with the Yugo and Hyundai Excel. Options were limited to just radio and AC, and suppliers, the UAW, dealers, and the state of Illinois all offered concessions to help lower the price of the car. Another final revision occurred in 1990 with a redesign of the dashboard, finally moving the HVAC controls from beside the driver's door to the middle. Driver's side airbag was added, larger exterior mirrors, and rear seat shoulder belts. But 1990 was the last year, and the twins were quietly discontinued. The Omni and Horizon are both, I believe, vastly overshadowed and largely forgotten by their competitors of the time. From the VW Rabbit to the Civic, the Accord, the Tercel, the Corolla, the Escort, GM's X-Bodies, and many more, it's largely dismissed as just an old design that was cheap. But a few things really stood out in the story of the L-platform cars. They quietly sold around 2.5 million versions in the 13 model years they had it, with few upgrades or changes. The much heralded K cars that helped save Chrysler and their variants sold just over 2 million between 81 and 88. These were not the forgotten slow sellers maybe many of us remember. Combined, they were still selling over 100,000 units a year in 1988. But more importantly is that the K cars and Chrysler itself may not have existed without the L-bodies. With bankruptcy looming, Iacocca and Chrysler had to go to the government with hat in hand and ask for bailouts, $1.5 billion in loan guarantees to continue developing the next generation of cars. And one of their arguments was that they were already working to compete with global products with smaller and more fuel-efficient design, as evidenced by their brand new hot sellers. In addition, the K cars that were to come and that saved the company were derived from the L-body platform. Furthermore, a minor part of their legacy is that the L-body was originally considered as the donating platform for what became the minivans, although thankfully it was determined that it was too light duty for that purpose. Ultimately, their legacy was tarnished by the fact that Chrysler essentially ignored it for 12 years. While the Civic and others went through multiple redesigns, the twins soldiered on with few updates. Imagine in 1990 buying an Omni or Horizon and you were really purchasing a 1970s car. oh, what could have been if they'd continued to invest in it. Thanks so much for being here, and many special thanks to my Patreons. This is only possible with their continued support. And if you support independent histories like this and news pinions and rant pinions, please consider supporting this channel and this video with a thumbs up. Let me know what you think below, guys. Thanks for being here.